Welcome to the Justice Stories Podcast, a series dedicated to presenting the stories of those who serve in the Department of Justice and those who work and live to serve the cause of justice in America. These are the stories behind the stories, told by the people who live them.
I was the agent in charge of the criminal half of the Washington field office of the FBI at that time. But we had a particular heavy burden, and as it seemed happens every 4 or 8 years, we start to get a little bit behind, and there starts to be a little bit of pressure and complaining that people aren't being cleared quick enough. So this was the end of March, so it's only 60 days into the new administration. And I was literally earlier that morning at FBI headquarters with the people in the section that handles those kind of investigations, going over and reprioritizing our work. So I left the building, and pulled out of the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C. onto the street. I got up onto the street. I had the commercial radio on to a regular news and music station, and I just started driving back to the Washington field office, which was then at Buzzards Point in Washington, D.C., and I heard an immediate news flash, and it was that the president has just been shot outside the Hilton. That's what the initial flash on the radio said.
The day was March 30th, 1981. 40 years ago. Tom Baker, now a retired FBI special agent, as it turned out, would be the first FBI agent on the scene of the infamous assassination attempt of President Ronald Reagan. Because of a few twists of fate, it happened he was also the senior FBI official in Washington that March day. Baker had a long and distinguished career in the Bureau, retiring after 33 years of service, in which he worked in many capacities on many cases. But obviously March 30th, 1981 stands out. The newly elected president was speaking at the Washington Hilton, addressing a meeting of the AFL-CIO. The Washington Hilton is a familiar venue for presidents, and the Secret Service knew it well. The venue had a specific protocol for such visits, even having a special passageway designed specifically for the chief executive. It is even called the President's Walk, making it one of the most secure such venues in the nation. It was one of many security upgrades developed following the Kennedy assassination in structures, procedures, and protocols. Bulletproof limousines, stricter processes, clearer chains of command, all of which contributed to saving the president's life. But a determined John Hinckley Jr. still managed to come far too close to being the fifth presidential assassin, exposing some weaknesses in those measures. Hinckley, in a deranged attempt to seize fame and impress actress Jodie Foster, was somehow able to seriously wound the president, along with White House Press Secretary James Brady, Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy, and D.C. police officer Thomas Delahanty. Nobody at the time suspected this was the work of a single mentally ill individual. What many of us don't realize is just how fraught the hours surrounding the event actually were. A few in the FBI, including Baker, feared instead a very credible Cold War-level threat. As it turned out, it was Baker and his team that were tasked with the investigation and with making order out of chaos.
So I immediately picked up the Motorola police-type radio back to the Washington field office, click to talk, and asked where the big incident was. And they said to me, what big incident? And of course, it had just literally that moment happened, and they didn't know about it yet in the Washington field office. So I had this discussion on the air with the operator at the station, and so I started heading north. There were two big Hiltons, and there still are, in Washington, D.C. The Washington Hilton at Connecticut and Florida Avenue, and the Capitol Hilton on 16th Street. And they're both north of my location. I started heading there, and then quickly heard, I assume on the commercial radio, that it was actually the Washington Hilton. So that's what I was doing when it happened as I headed to the scene. When I got there, I expected, as often happened when I would be out and about the town, if I heard there was a bank robbery, I'd go to the scene of the bank robbery, basically just to show my face, show interest. I'd leave the agents to work it and then leave the scene. But I always, anytime I went to a bank robbery, I'd find there was 6 or 8 or 12 agents already there. When I arrived in front of the Hilton, there were no FBI agents there yet. It was already a chaotic scene. Ambulances were starting to arrive. The Marines had dispatched 2 heavy helicopters, which were just above the roof line, making a heck of a lot of noise. The street was very congested. I was the assistant agent in charge of the Washington Field Office. At that time, the Washington Field Office was headed by a special agent in charge, as most offices still are. Today, Washington Field Office is headed by an assistant director. But back then, there was an SAC in charge, special agent in charge, and there were 2 assistant ASACs, as we call them in the FBI, ASACs, ASACs. At that time, one, myself, had the criminal side of the house, and the other fellow, Phil Parker, had what we called then foreign counterintelligence, the intelligence side of the house. So the situation nationally, and most people had some awareness of it, there was a high degree of tension with the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan, the new president, had taken a rather strong stand. And overseas, the solidarity movement in Poland was in full throttle, and the Soviets were going to intervene in Poland. Now, in the Washington Field Office, we had more of an awareness than most people of the state of tension in the world, because we had been asked to increase our coverage on the Russian Soviet diplomatic situation in Washington, D.C. If we picked up any additional information, to make that immediately available. And in the course of learning that, we learned that the Soviets were planning to have a massive military incursion into Poland in the coming days. What I didn't know at that time, that is now public information, it's in several books and been declassified, is that the Soviets had a picket line of submarines on both our coasts. The U.S. government had known that to some extent for a long time. In the preceding 24 hours, the picket line of submarines had been moved into a closer position, and that caused great concern to the Department of Defense and the White House officials.
And this is the deeper layer of threat lurking before the entire national security apparatus, including Tom Baker, as he was pulling into the scene of the assassination attempt. The possibility that we were on the edge of a precipice in a global conflict with our arch-rival, the Soviet Union. As Baker arrived at the Washington Hilton, the president had already been whisked away, having received his nearly fatal wound while being pushed into the awaiting limo.
Well, yes, he was whisked away immediately. He was shot as he was being pushed into the limo, and as soon as the agent, Jerry Parr, who pushed him into the limo, the door got closed behind him, they took off. I learned later that they were initially heading, which was part of their protocol, back to the White House. But within the seconds inside the car, the president was coughing up blood. They made an on-the-spot decision not to go to the White House, to go to the nearest hospital, which was a GW Hospital, George Washington Hospital, which was a very good decision because being in a city, in an urban area, the emergency room at that hospital had seen gunshots. Other parts of the country, you could go to an emergency room and the people there never saw gunshot wounds. So that's where they headed. I left my door open. We did not have then yet cell phones. I did have a car phone in the car, and of course I had the traditional police type radio, the Motorola radio, back to the Washington field. So as I started to open the car door, I left it open so I could get back to the car to communicate. The whole 3 or 4 minutes in driving to the scene, I had been on the FBI net to the radio back with various instructions back and forth. It was an incredibly chaotic scene, those first few minutes. The other thing about the background that day was at the national level, the vice president was not in Washington. The vice president was in Texas at that moment. He was flying between two cities, Austin, the capital, and Fort Worth. So he was out of touch. And in Washington, D.C., the FBI director, Judge Webster, was having the first of what became an annual retreat with the special agents in charge. And that was at the bottom of the Delmarva Peninsula. So RSAC in Washington and the director in Washington, as well as most of the hierarchy in FBI headquarters, were all at this offsite. So as the assistant agent in charge of the Washington field office, I was in fact in charge of the office that day as well. And we didn't have a lot of other people to turn to. This overshadows the entire day. People of my vintage and older in the FBI and in the government and the American public in general, we were somewhat haunted, and I'll use that word, by the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, which had happened just 20 years earlier. And we had all heard stories in law enforcement, and in fact, a lot of us as children had even seen it on television, that there's no other word for it, disgraceful performance of law enforcement the day and the following day that Kennedy was killed in Dallas. The sheriff's office, the police department, the FBI, the Secret Service were all fighting with each other. No one was in charge. The jurisdiction was not very clear. Things were mishandled, and then they were mishandled to the extent that the assassin, Oswald, was exposed so that this other character, Jack Ruby, could shoot him, assassinate him on television in front of the whole world. That killing of the assassin before he could be interviewed contributed to all sorts of conspiracy theories, some of which linger to today. So in my mind, I did not want to mishandle this thing. I knew it was a historic case and I wanted to do it right. It turns out, in retrospect, a lot of the other people that day, be they with the police department, the Secret Service, the FBI, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney himself, Chuck Ruff, who played quite an activist role in this, all had the same thing in their mind. This is a historic case. We have to handle it right. We have to do everything by the book, by the numbers. I had in the back of my mind, again, haunted by the Kennedy case, the fear that there might be a turf war. I knew there had been, I was trained to it, a statute enacted that the FBI had jurisdiction concerning any assault on the president. And I was fearing there might be a turf war. I got on the scene. As soon as I got out of the car, the first person who came up to me, literally within seconds, was Jimmy Wilson, who was a captain in charge of the homicide section of the Washington Metropolitan Police Department, and he literally ran up to me. He knew my face, he knew me, and he had in a glassine envelope, a clear plastic envelope, the revolver that they had just taken off the shooter. And he ran up to me with it, and he said, "Here's the gun, we just took it off the shooter." And I told him, I said, "Hold on to that. The FBI lab is sending a crime scene truck. I wanted to keep the chain of evidence short." I said, "Give it directly to the lab." And literally within another 10, 15 seconds, a fellow Powers, P-O-W-I-S, who I also had previously met, he was the agent in charge, SAIC in Secret Service parlance, of the Secret Service Washington field office. And he came up to me, and those were his words: "You're FBI, you're taking charge here now." And I think he really wanted to say that because it turns out he had been trained to the new rules, and he wanted to get it off his chest. The Secret Service is handing this over to the FBI. So there was no turf war. There was no disagreement. Everybody understood the new rules. Well, there was tons of law enforcement there already in this first couple of minutes. A lot of uniformed police, a lot of other police that I recognized, like Jimmy Wilson, a lot of Secret Service. I also recognized, actually, the U.S. Park Police had people on the scene already. Perhaps they had been there earlier. And they're all just, a lot of them are now coming towards me, congregating around me. And I'm literally looking around for some agents in the crowd. And the agents only started to arrive behind me, one by one, two by two. So that was a challenge. I had all these thoughts in my mind of the different immediate assignments we'd have to give. But it was quite a chaotic scene.
In our next episode, retired FBI Special Agent Tom Baker takes us through the investigation in the aftermath of the assassination attempt. The Justice Stories podcast is produced for the U.S. Department of Justice by the Office of Legal Education in the Executive Office for United States Attorneys. Mark Yancey, Chief Learning Officer for OLE, is executive producer. Angela Dooley, Assistant Chief Learning Officer, is supervisory producer. If you have any comments and suggestions for the Justice Stories podcast, contact producer Tim Carrier at tim.carrier@usdoj.gov. We want to hear your justice stories.